Hello, this is Jonathan Jimbo here. I'm here with the third episode of the Siege Stepladder, and today we're looking at Anakim's Advance. So, Anakim's Advance is my favourite map, and I think it is one of the easiest to score big on for a number of reasons. On the other hand, there are a few skills that you're going to need in order to be able to score big on this map, which is why I've waited to put this as third in the Siege Stepladder series rather than right at the start. Now, what's the challenge for this video? Well, I think the goal at this stage in the Siege Stepladder is to aim for 4 million points. On the other hand, this is a goal that you'll need to keep working at in order to achieve. So the first step would obviously be to try and score your first million, then try and improve that, and eventually applying the techniques that I'm going to demonstrate in this video in order to get a score of 4 million. Unlike the previous challenge, I'm not going to insist in an average, but if you want to try and average above a certain score, then it's certainly good practice. On top of the scoring requirement, I'm also going to impose an additional challenge requirement, and that's that you're not allowed to use the left holy ground for the Anakim spawns. So you're only allowed to use the central holy ground to score from the main source of points, which are the spawns from Anakim himself. The reason for imposing such a constraint is it makes everything a lot more consistent, because if you're going after Anakim from the left, well, this only happens in certain waves, and some of those waves it's up to the RNG in order to determine which side Anakim comes from. On the other hand, if you're using the central holy ground, you're guaranteed to get a scoring opportunity basically every wave. Later on, once you've achieved this challenge, then that's the time to go on and introduce the left holy ground into your game. But for now, I think what's important is to work on the core skills, and that's the idea of this challenge. So it's not necessarily to score your biggest while you're doing the challenge, but it's to train the necessary skills that you're going to need in order to score big in the future. So this video is an 8.4 million run following the challenge requirements. Now that's double the scoring bar, but again it will show you the key techniques that you're going to need to score 4 million. It's just I've had a lot of practice on this map. I didn't want to set the challenge requirement high so that nobody could achieve it, so instead I've put a lot of leeway between what I'm currently able to do and where the bar for the challenge is set. Now I know you want to see my 10 million run, and trust me, we'll get there and hopefully even further than that, but this video aims to teach the core fundamentals, which are using the central holy ground, and that doesn't apply to my 10 million run. So back to the challenge at hand. What is my overall strategy for this map, and how does that extend from the techniques that you will already be familiar with from both Lost Passage and Saint's Approach? The first is farming arrows from Cupid headshots. Now, I know that this is something that most players will find exceptionally difficult, and well, I'm here to try and give a few tips on that. So one tip will be the same as one that RB Avenue gave in one of his videos, and that is a Donnie Darko aiming style, where what you do is you trace the path of the enemy using your bow. And if you specifically trace the path of the head of the Cupid, then you can get an idea of, the Cupid's flight path. Now, due to the Cupid's flight speed, it doesn't suffice to just follow the path and let go of the arrow. you'll need to move your bow much further than the Cupid, at a faster rate than the Cupid's flying speed, in order to get it in position before you let go of the arrow if you want to achieve that headshot. The vertical distance also matters. If I can often fail the Cupid headshot from aiming just a bit too low. Now, with practice you can shortcut this process, and you'll get a feel for exactly where you need to place the bow in order to have the best chance of getting that headshot. But I think to start with, a more laboured process is what you need, and then you can shortcut it the more you practice. My second tip with going for Cupid headshots is your standing position. Because Cupids go from left to right, and that applies to most Cupids on the map, though it does depend on where you trigger them from, because there are some Cupids that go from right to left, but for the purposes of these tips I'm going to assume that the Cupid is going from left to right here, and that's a key difference from most of the other enemies passing to the gate, which are going from right to left. Now, because they're going from left to right, that can often mean that you end up putting your bow in an awkward position if you're trying to move further on in the Cupid's flight path. So you end up in a more awkward position if you're standing facing the Cupid directly, whereas if you're standing such that your left side is facing the Cupid, you're more likely to get that headshot. And I'm assuming that you're playing right-handed here. If you're playing left-handed, then it's completely different. My final tip for getting Cupid headshots is planning exactly where you trigger them from. So my personal recommendation is to trigger them fairly close to the gate, and that gives you the best chance and angle required to get that headshot. It is important to bear in mind that if you kill Anakim, if the last hit that kills Anakim is a headshot, that counts towards your headshot counter, and consequently when you're going to spawn a Cupid. On the other hand, non-killing headshots on Anakim, they will increase your combo, so you can use them to reset your combo timer, but they won't count towards your headshot counter. They won't reset your headshot counter assuming that you land a headshot on Anakim. Obviously, if you land a body shot on Anakim, that will reset your headshot counter. So my overall strategy is as follows. So for the first 5 waves, I think the primary focus is on getting the arrows you need. It is also extremely beneficial to get a full combo and perfect wave on wave 2. And there's a good reason for that, and that is in how the shot works. So the way the shot works, and I'm specifically talking about the ×3, is that every 4 waves you will see all 4 of the arrows in a random order, and that means that in the first wave, well, the choice of arrow is completely random, but in the second wave the choice of arrow is still random, but it's impossible to get the arrow that you got on wave 1, and then similarly on wave 3 you can't get the arrows that you got on waves 1 and 2. Finally, on wave 4, what pops up is the arrow that didn't pop up in waves 1, 2 and 3. So this pattern repeats from waves 5 to 8, and then this pattern repeats again from waves 9 to 12. I'm not entirely sure how waves 13 to 15 work. I assume what happens is it works similarly, but then there's one arrow that just doesn't come up. So for this map, you're going to want to be buying both Tempest and Hand of God in the ×3. And that's perhaps a difference from what you'll want to be buying in, for example, Saint's Approach. And the key difference here is certainly in the first 4 waves, you want to be able to buy both Tempest and Hand of God when they appear in the ×3. And it is possible that you have, let's say, Tempest on wave 1 and Hand of God on wave 2 and vice versa. Now, that is totally RNG whether that actually happens, but it's certainly possible. And it's important that you have the starting goal required to achieve that. So firstly, you want to have basically all your achievements, but well, if you have all of your achievements, that'll give you the gold that you need in order to buy the ×3 on wave 1, unless you can get your perfect and full combo on wave 2, then there's a good chance that you won't have the gold required in order to buy the ×3 on wave 2. Note that every 1 point you get is 1 gold, so the gold that you get is related to the points that you score. You'll also want to be buying incursions in the ×3, although I don't recommend buying incursions in the first 4 waves unless you've already bought the Tempest and the Hand of God in that particular shot rotation and you have enough gold to do so. Now, if you're scoring well, later on in the run, you'll be able to start buying ×2 for both Hand of God, Tempest and Incursion. So if you can afford it, I recommend doing so. Now, bear in mind that each time you buy a particular arrow, that will double the price the next time that particular arrow appears, and that includes in both the ×1, ×2 and ×3 slots. So if you repeatedly buy arrows in, let's say, ×2, that means that that will not only affect the price of arrows in that ×2 slot, but that will also affect the price of that particular arrow in the ×3 slot and also in the ×1 slot. Now, whether you should, from wave 6 onwards, whether you should use the wave for farming and scoring will depend on a number of things. Now, if it were a normal run, it would depend on which side Anakim comes from. But in this challenge, we're only using the central holy ground. So therefore, the side that Anakim comes from is not really a factor anymore. What is a factor? Well, firstly, if you screw up your perfect, and this is especially in the early waves, well, from wave 6, once you get to around wave 10, you don't really want to be using waves to farm anymore. Ideally, you want to have finished farming by wave 8 or 9, but it is partly dependent on the arrows that you get. From wave 10 onwards, even if you miss and ruin your perfect, I would still recommend going for scoring on that wave, assuming that you're not extremely tight for arrows. From wave 6 onwards, if you're going to be using a wave for farming, I recommend using Hand of God to help you get those Cupid headshots, and I specifically recommend using the Hand of God on the Anakim spawns once they get into a position somewhat close to the gate where you can farm the Cupid headshots. Well, you farm the spawns via headshots, and that will spawn Cupid that you can then use to headshot for arrows. So this sums up my overall strategy for the map, but what's my strategy for individual waves, and specifically when I'm focused on scoring? So the first thing is, where possible, you ideally want to have 2 headshots queued up from the previous wave before you go. And note that you can still place incursions between waves, and that won't reset your headshot counter. The next step is you want to, as fast as you can, be able to get the central holy ground lit up, because if you don't get the central holy ground lit up before Anakim gets to it, then you're not really going to be able to score much points from this wave. So you may also want to use Hand of God in order to slow Anakim down, and this is especially true if he comes from the right, because if he comes from the right, he gets to the place where the central holy ground would normally appear much faster, so you have much less time in order to get it lit up. It's also important that you're comfortable with headshotting not only the Knights and Abominations, but also the Skeletons too. And this is the reason why I've made this map the third in the Stepladder series, is because that's something that's going to take practice. being able to get Cupid headshots will also help, not just for the arrows, but for the simple fact that a Cupid headshot counts towards your headshot counter, so then you only need 2 more headshots before you can spawn another Cupid. Once you've got the central holy ground lit up, the next thing you want to do is keep your combo until Anakim gets into position. Now, to do that, you need to be able to make a shot, I think, roughly every 5 seconds. And obviously you don't want to miss a shot, because that will break your combo in itself. Now, you can use the slow time to delay the combo timer, and you can use that to help plan what you're going to do. It's important that you're not too trigger happy, because if you are, you can easily end up running out of enemies. And if your planning was poor, if that happens when Anakim is hiding behind a pillar, that can make you lose your combo, because you can use headshots on Anakim to extend your combo. But, you know, if Anakim is hiding behind a pillar when this happens, then that's just poor planning, and you want to avoid such a situation happening at all costs. So when is Anakim in position? Well, that's roughly at the moment that Anakim first enters the holy ground. So you want to get the timing right, and as soon as Anakim enters that holy ground, you want to put a hand of God on Anakim's knee. And it's got to be fairly low down. If it's too high, it won't work for its purpose, because it's not only got to slow Anakim down, but it's also got to catch all of Anakim's spawns in the best grouping possible over the holy ground. Then what you want to do is you want to kill Anakim, spawning all of Anakim's spawns all over the holy ground. Ideally, you want to get them in one big group, and I'll explain why in a bit. But once you've killed Anakim, you immediately want to go for the bell. And since Anakim spawns have recently spawned in, the rage mode should affect them. Then what you want to do is fire a tempest through the gap, but at such an angle that it gets as many enemies as possible over that holy ground, but with an ambush. So you want to get it so because tempest is essentially a cylinder that's travelling, you want it so that only the enemy's heads are within that circle. And this is important because, well, the ambush gives you double points, and the more enemies you can get with a single tempest, not only does that give you the biggest multi-kill bonus, it also means that you end up using less tempests in order to kill the enemies. Now that's the money shot, but ideally you want to keep your perfect. So there's often going to be some enemies that have been left behind, and some of those enemies will be affected by rage mode. So one strategy here is to play it safe, just body shot any raged enemies, and if you have a slew of enemies, you can use crowd control arrows such as Hand of God in order to keep them together. Now, ideally you'd want to finish the wave with a headshot counter of 2, but if that's too much of a risk, I recommend just sacrificing that and instead just focus on making sure that you get your perfect. This is also why placing a sea of incursions by the gate is also important, because you can let the enemies essentially crash on those incursions, and that will defend the gate. And this is important if you're wanting your perfect, because if any enemy goes through, it's bye-bye perfect. It's also important as when you're making the big money shot, your focus is on Anakim and hitting the tempest on those spawns. But if there are any other enemies on the map, your focus is not on those enemies, and you ideally don't want to have to divert your attention. So it's important that you've got those incursions in place that those enemies can crash on, so that you can focus on making the critical shots. The only time this strategy, I think, changes slightly, I think, is on waves 14 and 15, because now you've got 2 Anakims. Do I recommend using Rage on the first Anakim? That depends. So the first thing to bear in mind if you're trying to Rage the first Anakim is the gate well defended with incursions? Because now you're going to have hordes of enemies that are going to rush through. They're going to rush through to the gate because they're going to be a lot faster with Rage. Now you can use Hand of God to partially defend against that, but even then there's going to be a lot of enemies, so it's important that you can just let enemies crash on the incursions. The second thing to bear in mind is the position of Anakim, the position of the second Anakim when you Rage the spawns generated from the first Anakim. If the second Anakim has just entered the fold as you hit the Rage mode, then that Rage is going to apply to Anakim himself, and he's just going to storm right down at a rate of knots, and that's going to make it much more difficult to get that critical Hand of God shot. In fact, that's messed me up several times, so it's definitely a big risk. Now, I do have a few techniques to be able to counter this, one being using 2 separate Hand of Gods, which makes it a lot safer, but then you run the risk of losing your combo, or at the very least ruining the grouping, and that will reduce the return on investment that you would otherwise get. So I would probably recommend, especially if the goal is just to simply complete the challenge and score 4 million, you don't really need to be raging the first Anakim on waves 14 and 15 to be able to score that much. So I probably wouldn't recommend taking the risk unless you're really behind and you otherwise have nothing to lose. And that about wraps it up for the commentary portion of the Siege Stepladder Volume 3. Good luck in completing the challenge, and also good luck in getting good scores on the Season 4 leaderboards before Season 5 begins.